This house has been sitting empty for over a year. It has 9 bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, a 20-seat private theater, an infinity pool with ocean views, and a tennis court. The asking price is $75 million, and not a single person on Earth has bought it. Today, we find out why. The address is 281 Bentley Circle, Los Angeles, California, listed under zip 90049 in the Bel-Air area, near core 90077 boundaries. That zip code, 90077, ranks among the most expensive in the entire United States, top 10 to 20 nationally. It sits in Bel-Air, a neighborhood tucked into the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains on the west side of Los Angeles. To give you a geographic picture, you have Beverly Hills to your southeast, Brentwood to your west, Sunset Boulevard to your south, and the mountain ridgeline above you. No apartments, no condos, no commercial streets, just estates. Together with Beverly Hills and Holmby Hills, Bel-Air forms what's known as the Platinum Triangle of Los Angeles neighborhoods. These are the 3 most prestigious residential zip codes in the city, and Bel-Air is considered the crown of that triangle, the most private, the most gated, and the most expensive per square foot. The median household income in Bel-Air is $206,000 to $220,000, 2024 estimates, among the highest figures for any neighborhood or city in Los Angeles County. But even that number is misleading because most of the wealthiest residents here operate on a scale that household income statistics can't capture. We're talking about people whose net worth starts at 9 figures. That is who this house was built for. To understand why a house here costs $75 million, you need to understand what this neighborhood actually is and how it came to exist. In 1922, a farmer named Alfonso Bell, who had struck oil a few years prior in Whittier, California, purchased a large estate and began subdividing it into what would become Bel-Air. It was his wife who named it. She loved Italy, and the name is believed to be a combination of the Italian word bello, meaning beautiful or good, and the English word air, inspired by the original Mexican land grant called Rancho San Jose de Buenos Aires. She also personally named most of the streets after Italian places: Bellagio Road, Nimes Road, Capello Drive. The first formal tract for the community was filed in 1923 and consisted of just 128 lots. And here's the irony that almost nobody knows. Despite Alfonso Bell's original policy of not allowing Hollywood actors to purchase property in Bel-Air, the community nevertheless became home to some of the biggest movie stars and entertainment moguls the world has ever seen. Ronald Reagan lived here. Elizabeth Taylor lived here. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the TV show, was set here, even though the exterior shots were actually filmed in Brentwood 100 years later. A single house on nearly 1.2 acres of that original land is listed for $75 million. Now let's talk about the house itself and who is responsible for it. 281 Bentley Circle is a 20,000 square foot mansion that came to market in May 2023 with a $75 million asking price, which works out to $3,750 per square foot. To put that in perspective, the average price per square foot for a home in the United States is around $155. This house is priced at more than 24 times that. The home was designed by Tagfront Architects, a Los Angeles-based firm founded in 1989. Tagfront has been consistently published and praised for its creative and cutting-edge work in publications like Dwell, Interior Design Magazine, and Surface, and has received multiple awards from the American Institute of Architects. The firm specializes in high-end residential, hospitality, and commercial projects. Their design philosophy for this home is what they call organic modernism. What that means in practice is this: instead of the cold, boxy glass box aesthetic that dominated luxury spec homes in the 2000s. Tagfront built something that curves with the land, uses natural textures, and blurs the line between indoor and outdoor space. The pool doesn't sit in a rectangle next to the house. It wraps around the building in a 250-foot curve, almost like the house is floating inside a moat. No expense was spared in using the world's finest materials throughout, from the Italian kitchen to Portuguese limestone and Calcutta marble covering the floors and walls. We'll get into the room-by-room breakdown shortly, but I want you to hold on to one number: $3,750 per square foot, because that is what the developers believe every single inch of this building is worth. Here's where the story gets complicated, because this house was listed at the exact moment the ultra-luxury market in Los Angeles started to collapse. When 281 Bentley Circle hit the market in May 2023, something significant was already happening in the city. Home sales in LA were down approximately 26% from January through September 2023 compared to the same period a year ago, and luxury home listings were sitting on the market twice as long as the average single-family home. In 2023, only 232 residences in the $10 million and above range sold in Los Angeles, a 37% decline compared to the 370 that changed hands in 2022. The downturn was attributed to rising interest rates, the Hollywood strike, and the area's newly enforced mansion tax. That mansion tax is worth explaining. In April 2023, the same month this house was gearing up to list, the city of Los Angeles implemented Measure ULA, a transfer tax on sales above $5 million, 4% tier, escalating to 5.5% over $10 million, which adds a significant extra cost to high-end transactions. On a $75 million sale, that tax alone adds approximately $2.9 million in additional costs that the buyer has to absorb at closing. So, the developers of 281 Bentley Circle listed a $75 million property into a market that was already freezing, with a brand new tax designed specifically to make expensive homes harder to sell. And that decision would define everything that happened next. Let's go inside. But before we walk through the front door, I want you to understand something about how this house was conceived. Most spec homes, even expensive ones, are built around a simple formula. Take a big lot, maximize square footage, add luxury finishes, price high, sell fast. The developer makes their margin and moves on. That is not what happened here. Tagfront architects spent years on this project, and their central obsession was a single question: what does it feel like to live here? Not what does it look like in a listing photo, not what does it photograph well for Instagram. What does it actually feel like to wake up here, walk through this space, and exist inside it? That distinction matters because it explains every decision they made. And it also explains why this house is so difficult to describe in a price tag. The property sits on 1.15 acres in the Bel-Air Hills. At first glance from the street, the home doesn't announce itself the way you might expect a $75 million mansion to. There's no grand gate flanked by marble lions, no fountain you can see from the road. The entrance is deliberately understated, almost quiet. A long, gated motor court leads you in, and the home reveals itself gradually. That restraint is intentional. This house was built for someone who has already proven everything they need to prove to the world. It doesn't need to shout. Once you're through the gate, you start to understand the scale. 20,000 square feet, 9 bedrooms, a primary master suite, 6 guest suites, and additional quarters, plus 13 bathrooms, spread across a structure that doesn't rise straight up like a tower, but instead flows outward, wrapping itself around the hillside, extending toward the canyon, reaching toward the Pacific in the distance. On a clear day, you can see the ocean from multiple rooms inside this house. That view alone, in this zip code at this elevation, is worth millions. Now let's go room by room. You enter through the main foyer, and the first thing that hits you is the ceiling height. We're talking about 14-foot ceilings in the primary living areas, with walls of floor-to-ceiling glass that frame the canyon below, like a painting that changes every hour of the day. The floors throughout the main level are Portuguese limestone, a pale, warm-toned stone quarried in a region of Portugal that has been exporting high-end building materials to the world for centuries. It is the kind of material that, if you know it, you recognize immediately. And if you don't know it, you just know that something about this floor feels different than any floor you've ever stood on. The living room and the outdoor terrace exist almost as a single continuous space. The glass walls retract fully. They don't just slide open, they disappear, so that the boundary between inside and outside dissolves entirely. You're standing in your living room, and then you're not, and then you are again, and there's no moment where you felt the transition happen. That's the organic modernism philosophy in practice. The architecture doesn't separate you from the land. It dissolves the distance between you and it. The kitchen is what the designers call the Italian kitchen, and the name is not decorative. The cabinetry, the fixtures, the entire cooking system was sourced from Italy, specifically from high-end European manufacturers whose products you will not find at any American retailer, not because they're rare, but because the people who buy them don't shop. They specify. An interior designer calls a European supplier. A container ship brings the components. A team of specialized installers assembles it on site. That is the supply chain for a kitchen at this level. The countertops are Calacatta marble, a white marble with dramatic gray and gold, veining quarried from the Apuan Alps in Tuscany. There is a reason Calacatta marble became the defining luxury material of the last decade. No two slabs are alike. It photographs beautifully, and it has a warmth that cold industrial materials cannot replicate.
The slabs used in this kitchen are book-matched, meaning two consecutive slabs were cut and mirrored against each other so that the veining forms a symmetrical pattern. That process alone requires precise quarrying, careful transport, and meticulous installation. It is the kind of detail that most people will never consciously notice, but that registers somewhere in the experience of being in a space. There are 9 bedrooms in this house, but the primary suite is in a category of its own. It occupies its own wing, not its own floor, its own wing, meaning it has its own orientation, its own views, its own relationship to the hillside. You wake up in this room, and the entire wall facing the canyon is glass. The primary bathroom, and I use the word bathroom loosely because it's closer to a spa, features floor-to-ceiling Calacatta marble, a soaking tub positioned directly against the window, so you are looking at the canyon while you bathe, dual vanities, a steam shower, and radiant heated floors. The closet attached to the primary suite is larger than most American bedrooms, but here is something interesting about the other 8 bedrooms. They are not afterthoughts. In most spec mansions of this size, the secondary bedrooms are essentially hotel rooms. Fine, functional, forgettable. Here, each room has its own design identity, its own proportions, its own view. The developers understood that the person buying this home is not buying it for themselves alone. They're buying it for how it makes everyone in their life feel when they're here. A home at this level functions as a statement of hospitality as much as residence. Below the main living level is where the home shifts registers entirely. This is where the amenity floor lives, and it operates more like a private members club than a house. The theater seats 20 people. Not 20 in a cramped home cinema sense, 20 in a way where each seat is a full recliner, where the screen is commercial scale, where the acoustic engineering was done by professionals who treat sound as a technical discipline. The room was designed from the inside out. The seats came first, then the sightlines, then the walls were built around the acoustic requirements. You can watch a film in this room and experience it the way the director intended it to be experienced. There is a full bar and entertainment lounge adjacent to the theater. There is a wellness suite that includes a gym, a sauna, and a massage room. There is a wine cellar. And then there is the pool. The pool deserves its own paragraph because it is not a pool in any conventional sense. It is a massive infinity edge pool that wraps around the exterior of the home in a long, sweeping curve. The engineering required to build a pool of that scale, at that elevation, on a hillside, while maintaining structural integrity and a consistent water level across the entire span, that is a significant technical achievement. The infinity edge is oriented toward the canyon and the ocean beyond it, so the water appears to fall off the edge of the world. At night, with the pool lit and the city lights below, the effect is something that photographs have a hard time capturing. You have to be standing in it. Adjacent to the pool is the tennis court, sized and surfaced to professional specifications. And around all of it, the pool, the court, the terraces, is approximately 8,000 square feet of outdoor living space, covered loggias, fire features, outdoor kitchens, the kind of environment where you can host 100 people and nobody feels crowded. So that is the house, 20,000 square feet, 9 bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, a theater for 20, a pool that wraps the building, ocean views from multiple rooms, Portuguese limestone, Calicut marble, Italian cabinetry, and 1.15 acres of Bel-Air hillside. The question is not whether this is an extraordinary property, it clearly is. The question is whether it is worth $75 million, and more specifically, whether anyone at the moment this home was asking that number was willing to pay it. Because when this house hit the market at $75 million, people walked through these rooms, stood at that infinity pool, looked out at that ocean view, and then quietly walked back to their cars and drove away. The answer, every single time, was no. And next, we're going to find out exactly why. So why hasn't it sold? That question sounds simple. But the answer involves 5 separate forces that all converged at the exact same moment. And understanding each one of them tells you something important, not just about this house, but about what happens when the top of the real estate market hits a wall.
This one surprises people because the assumption is that buyers at the $75 million level don't care about interest rates. They're paying cash. They don't have a mortgage. So why would the Federal Reserve's decisions in Washington affect whether someone buys a mansion in Bel-Air? The answer is that it doesn't affect them directly. It affects them indirectly, through the psychology of capital. When interest rates are near zero, as they were from 2020 through early 2022, money is cheap. Borrowing is cheap. And more importantly, the opportunity cost of parking $75 million in a piece of real estate is low, because there's nowhere else for that money to generate a meaningful return with any kind of safety. So it flows into hard assets, into art, into real estate, into anything that holds value. That is a significant part of what drove luxury home prices to historic highs during the pandemic years. Then the Fed began raising rates in March 2022. By the time this house listed in May 2023, the federal funds rate had climbed from near zero to over 5%, and it would reach 5.25 to 5.5% by that July. Suddenly, a buyer with $75 million in liquid capital has options. Safe options, treasury bonds, high-yield accounts, instruments that generate real returns without requiring you to own, staff, insure, and maintain a 20,000 square foot mansion in the hills. The calculus on buying a trophy property changed, not because the property got worse, but because the rest of the financial world got more attractive. We touched on this in the first segment, but it's worth going deeper because the timing was almost surgically bad for this listing. Measure ULA, the Unified Los Angeles Transfer Tax, went into effect on April 1st, 2023. This house listed in May 2023. The tax imposes a 5.5% transfer tax on any residential sale above $10 million in the city of Los Angeles. On a $75 million transaction, that is $4.125 million in tax. Customarily, that cost falls on the seller at closing, though like everything in a negotiation of this size, who ultimately absorbs it is subject to the deal itself. Either way, it gets priced in from the start, and both sides know it. Now, $4 million on a $75 million deal might sound like a rounding error to people operating at that level, but that is not how ultra-high net worth buyers think. These are people who built their wealth precisely because they do not treat any number as a rounding error. They have advisors, they have tax attorneys. They look at a $4 million transfer tax, and they do not shrug. They ask, is there a structure that avoids this? Can we take title differently? Can we buy through an entity? And often the answer is yes, but that adds complexity, legal overhead, and time to a transaction that was already complicated. More importantly, the mansion tax created a perception problem. Los Angeles suddenly felt like a city that was hostile to large real estate transactions. And when you're a buyer considering whether to commit $75 million to a single asset in a single city, perception matters enormously. There are other cities, there are other countries, there are other properties. This one is specific to Los Angeles in a way that doesn't apply to luxury markets in other cities. The entertainment industry is the economic engine of Bel-Air. Not in the sense that most residents are working actors, they're not. But the wealth that concentrates in this neighborhood flows from the business of entertainment. Studio executives, talent agents, producers, major directors, and the investors and financiers who orbit that world. These are people whose liquidity, whose ability to write a check, is directly tied to the health of the industry they operate in. In May 2023, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. In July, the Screen Actors Guild followed. By the time both strikes were resolved, the WGA in late September, SAG in early November, the industry had been functionally frozen for the better part of 6 months. Development deals stalled, productions shut down, bonuses didn't get paid, and the people who would ordinarily be the most natural buyers for a $75 million property in Bel-Air were sitting on their hands, not necessarily because they couldn't afford it, but because the industry around them was in a state of paralysis, and nobody makes a major capital commitment during paralysis. $75 million is not just a number. It is a statement, and statements carry risk. To understand what $75 million means in context, you have to look at the comparable sales, what real estate agents call comps, in the Bel-Air and Greater Platinum Triangle area at the time this house listed. In 2023, only 232 homes priced above $10 million sold in all of Los Angeles. Not 232 in Bel-Air, 232 in the entire city. And the vast majority of those were clustered in the $10 to $20 million range. Sales above $50 million in a single year in Los Angeles can often be counted on two hands. What that means is that this house had almost no comparable transactions to validate its price. It was priced at a level where the market is so thin that there is no reliable mechanism for determining what something is worth. Only what a single willing buyer and a single willing seller agree to on a given day. And finding that one buyer for that one property at that one price point requires a very specific convergence of timing, taste, and liquidity that cannot be manufactured or rushed. The developers knew this going in. A price of $75 million was always going to require patience. What they didn't fully account for was how many other headwinds would arrive at the same time. It is the simple fact that at $75 million, you are not selling a house. You are selling a lifestyle transformation, and lifestyle transformations are not rational purchases. A buyer at this level has options. They always have options. They can buy a similarly sized property in Miami, or in Greenwich, or in London, or in Dubai, for a fraction of what this house costs, and in some of those markets with dramatically lower taxes, better weather consistency, or more favorable legal environments for protecting wealth. The person who buys a $75 million house in Bel-Air is not buying it because it is the most financially efficient use of their capital. They are buying it because they want to live in Bel-Air. They want that specific address, that specific view, that specific statement. And the question, the deeply personal, irrational, emotional question, is whether this particular house, on this particular street, at this particular price, is the one that makes them feel that way. For over a year, nobody answered yes. That is not necessarily a verdict on the house. It may be a verdict on the moment, on the market, on the confluence of five forces that made 2023 and into 2024 one of the most hostile environments for ultra-luxury real estate that Los Angeles had seen in a generation. But here's what makes this story genuinely interesting. Because eventually, in markets like this, something gives. Either the price moves, or the market moves. Or a buyer appears who has been waiting for exactly this thing and simply hadn't been found yet. So next, we're going to look at what actually happened, what the developers did when the market didn't come to them, and what that tells us about how the ultra-luxury real estate game is really played when the cameras aren't rolling. When a house at this level struggles to find a buyer, a very specific and carefully managed set of responses gets triggered. There are no panic signs, no price-slashed banners in the window, no open house on a Sunday afternoon where anyone can walk through. What happens instead is quieter, more strategic, and in many ways more revealing about how this market actually operates than the original listing ever was. To understand it, you need to understand one fundamental truth about ultra-luxury real estate. The listing price is not an offer. It is an opening position in a negotiation that may take years, and 281 Bentley Circle is not the only property to test that truth. Across Bel-Air, across the Platinum Triangle, across every ultra-luxury market in the country, versions of this story play out constantly, just out of public view. So let's use this house as a lens to understand how the market actually works when a trophy property and a frozen moment collide. The first thing that happens when a house at this level doesn't move is that the listing agent shifts strategy from broadcasting to targeting. When a property like this first comes to market, the public listing serves a specific purpose. It establishes the asset's existence at a certain price in the market's memory. It tells every serious buyer, every serious agent, and every serious investor in the ultra-luxury space that this property is available at this number. But public listings have a cost. Every week, a home sits publicly listed without selling. It accumulates what agents call days on market. And days on market is a number that sophisticated buyers watch very closely. The longer a property sits, the more a buyer wonders, what is wrong with it? Even if the answer is nothing, even if the house is extraordinary and the only issue is that the market is frozen, the days on market number plants a seed of doubt. And doubt in a $75 million transaction is extremely difficult to dislodge. So, at a certain point, the calculus shifts. The listing goes quiet. It comes off the public market, or stays on only technically, without active promotion. And the agent begins working what is known in the industry as a pocket listing strategy. Instead of broadcasting to everyone, you identify the people on Earth who could plausibly buy this house, and you go to them directly. You call their family offices. You reach out to their wealth managers. You work the relationships that exist below the surface of the public market, in a world that most people never see. At this price point, the buyer pool is genuinely that small. Let's put a number on it. There are approximately 900 billionaires in the United States. Of those, a meaningful subset have any interest in Los Angeles residential real estate. Of that subset, an even smaller number are in the market for primary or secondary residence at the $75 million level at any given moment. And of that group, you then have to find the one person whose specific taste, whose specific vision of what their life looks like, aligns with what this particular house offers. That is the actual buyer pool. Not millions of people, not thousands, dozens on a good day. And reaching them requires a different kind of infrastructure than a standard listing. This is why relationships are the real currency of ultra-luxury real estate. The agents who operate at this level, and there are very few of them, maintain networks that function more like private intelligence systems than traditional sales operations. They know which family offices are actively looking. They know which international buyers have been circling the Los Angeles market. They know whose divorce just settled, whose company just went public, whose fund just closed. Because those are the moments when liquidity appears and decisions get made. There is also a second strategy that gets deployed when a property doesn't move at its asking price, the quiet price adjustment. This is not the same as a public price cut. A public price cut is a signal, and not always a good one. It tells the market that the seller blinked. It confirms that the original price was aspirational rather than grounded, and it invites buyers to wonder how much further the seller will go. In a thin market with sophisticated buyers, a public price reduction can actually slow a sale rather than accelerate it because it shifts the buyer's psychology from, "I need to act before someone else does," to, "I should wait and see how low this goes." What happens instead, in many cases, is that the seller communicates flexibility through private channels. The listing price stays where it is publicly, but agents working with qualified buyers are told, quietly, off the record, that there is room to negotiate, that the seller is motivated, that a serious offer in a certain range will be received seriously. The number on the listing becomes almost decorative. The real negotiation happens in a parallel conversation that leaves no public trace. This is how the ultra-luxury market actually clears, not through open bidding, not through transparent price discovery, through a series of private conversations between people who trust each other enough to say what they actually mean. Now, here is where the story of this house connects to something larger. Properties like 281 Bentley Circle are not anomalies. They are case studies in what happens to an entire segment of the market when multiple forces align against it simultaneously. And what happened in Los Angeles between 2023 and 2024 was not just a slowdown. It was a structural reset. The pandemic era had created a version of the ultra-luxury market that was, in retrospect, unsustainable. Low interest rates, enormous wealth creation in tech and finance, a wave of relocation from urban centers, and a cultural moment where conspicuous real estate became a status signal in a way it hadn't been before. All of that combined to push prices to levels that required a very specific set of conditions to hold. When those conditions changed, the market didn't correct gradually. It stopped. And the properties that suffered most were exactly the ones at the very top. The highest priced, most uniquely positioned assets with the thinnest buyer pools. Because those are the properties where the gap between what a seller believes something is worth and what a buyer is willing to pay is most likely to become unbridgeable, at least temporarily. But here is what I want you to take away from this. Because it is easy to look at a $75 million house that struggles to sell and conclude that something went wrong, that the developers miscalculated, that the price was arrogant, that the market delivered a verdict. Maybe. But consider the alternative framing. A house built to this standard, on 1.15 acres in Bel-Air, with these views, this architecture, these materials, was priced at a level that reflected genuine confidence in what it represented. It entered a market that was facing a historically unusual combination of headwinds, and it waited. Patience in ultra-luxury real estate is not a failure. It is a strategy. The developer who panics and drops the price by $20 million in the first year crystallizes a loss. The developer who holds, who manages the carrying costs, maintains the relationships, keeps the property pristine and available, is betting that the right buyer in the right moment will eventually arrive. That bet is not irrational. Some of the most significant luxury real estate transactions in history happened years after a property first listed. The market for a $75 million home in Bel-Air is not governed by quarterly earnings cycles. It operates on a different timescale entirely. And the evidence suggests that timescale can work. By 2024, the ultra-luxury market in Los Angeles had begun to show signs of recovery. Bel-Air average sale prices were rising again. Mega deals were closing. The forces that had frozen the market, the rate shock, the strike, the initial chaos of the mansion tax, had not disappeared. But the market had begun to absorb them and move forward anyway. So the question for any trophy property in this position is never really whether it will sell. It is when, and at what price. And what that final number, whatever it turns out to be, tells us about the true value of extraordinary things in a world that is constantly recalibrating what extraordinary is worth. Next, we're going to zoom out, because the story of this house is really the story of Bel-Air itself and what it means, in 2025 and beyond, to own the most expensive address in one of the most expensive cities on Earth, at a moment when the very concept of where the ultra-wealthy choose to live is changing faster than it ever has before. Let's zoom out. Because everything we've talked about so far, the house, the price, the market, the mechanics of how ultra-luxury real estate actually moves, all of it exists inside a larger story. A story about a neighborhood, about a city, and about a fundamental question that the wealthiest people in the world are asking themselves right now with more urgency than at any point in the last generation. That question is, where do I actually want to live? And the answer, increasingly, is not as obvious as it used to be. For most of the 20th century, the geography of American wealth was relatively stable. If you made enough money in entertainment, you moved to Bel-Air or Beverly Hills. If you made it in finance, you went to Greenwich or the Upper East Side. If you made it in technology, you stayed in Northern California. Wealth had its neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods had their logic. Proximity to industry, proximity to peers, proximity to the institutions and infrastructure that wealth requires. That logic held for decades, and Bel-Air sat at the top of it. The Platinum Triangle wasn't just expensive because people had money. It was expensive because the people who had money in the industries that dominated American culture, entertainment, media, the business of fame, all needed to be in Los Angeles. And if you were in Los Angeles and you had enough, you were in Bel-Air. That equation is now being renegotiated than anyone in the traditional luxury real estate market anticipated. The first pressure point is geography itself. Remote work, or more precisely the decoupling of professional identity from physical location, changed the calculus for a segment of ultra-high net worth individuals in a way that is still playing out. A tech founder whose company is headquartered in San Francisco no longer needs to be in San Francisco. A hedge fund manager whose counterparties are distributed across time zones no longer needs to be in Greenwich. And an entertainment executive who runs meetings over video and whose productions are filmed on location around the world no longer needs, strictly speaking, to be in Los Angeles. This doesn't mean Bel-Air empties out. It doesn't. The neighborhood is as populated with serious wealth as it has ever been. But it does mean that the pool of people for whom Bel-Air is the only logical choice has narrowed. And when that pool narrows, the competitive pressure that drives prices upward softens, not dramatically, not permanently, but measurably. The second pressure point is tax policy. California has the highest marginal income tax rate of any state in the country, 13.3% at the top bracket, with proposed surcharges that would push that figure even higher. Combined with federal rates, a top earner in California can face a marginal rate approaching 50 cents on every additional dollar earned. For someone generating significant income, a studio executive with a nine-figure deal, a founder with equity events, that number is not abstract. It is a material consideration in every financial decision they make. And the mansion tax, which we've already discussed, sits on top of all of that. What Measure ULA did was not just add a transaction cost, it sent a signal that Los Angeles was willing to use its most valuable real estate as a revenue mechanism, and that future iterations of that mechanism were possible. The response from a segment of the ultra-wealthy was predictable, and it was already underway before the mansion tax passed. Florida, Texas, Nevada, states with no income tax, favorable estate planning environments, and, critically, luxury real estate markets that were actively competing for exactly the buyers that California was making uncomfortable. Miami's ultra-luxury market didn't just grow during this period, it transformed. According to Douglas Elliman, the number of $100 million plus sales in Miami tripled between 2020 and 2025. The kind of trophy property transactions that used to happen exclusively in Los Angeles and New York began happening in Miami at a pace that the market had never seen before. The third pressure point is safety and quality of life. This is the most sensitive one to discuss because it touches on political and social questions that are genuinely contested. But in the context of a $75 million real estate decision, it cannot be ignored. Los Angeles spent much of the early 2020s navigating a set of urban challenges, homelessness, property crime, public infrastructure, that generated significant national media coverage and genuine concern among residents at every income level. For ultra-high net worth individuals making location decisions, the perception of a city's trajectory matters as much as its current reality. And the perception of Los Angeles, in certain circles, shifted during this period in ways that affected real estate decisions. This is not a permanent verdict on the city. Los Angeles has reinvented itself repeatedly over its history. It remains one of the most culturally vital, economically significant, and genuinely extraordinary places in the world. But perception operates on its own timeline, independent of reality. And in the ultra-luxury market, where buyers have maximum optionality, perception is enough to redirect capital. Now set all of that against what Bel-Air actually is, and you start to understand why the story of 281 Bentley Circle matters beyond the property itself. Bel-Air is not just a neighborhood, it is a concept. It represents a particular idea of what success looks like in America. Specifically, the version of success that the entertainment industry defined and exported to the world for a century. The gated estate in the hills above Los Angeles, the privacy, the views, the distance from the ordinary world, maintained architecturally and psychologically. That concept has enormous power. It has survived wars, recessions, earthquakes, and cultural shifts. It has absorbed waves of new wealth, tech money, sports money, international money, and remained coherent as a symbol. But symbols are not immune to the forces that reshape everything else. And the forces reshaping where the ultra-wealthy choose to live are real, structural, and accelerating. What we are watching in Bel-Air right now is not a collapse. The neighborhood is not emptying. The properties are not worthless. The views are not going anywhere, and neither is the history. What we are watching is a recalibration, a process by which the market is figuring out what this address is worth in a world where the assumptions that made it worth so much are being tested simultaneously from multiple directions. And that brings us back to this house. 281 Bentley Circle represents the apex of what Bel-Air can offer. The best architecture, the best materials, the best views, the best amenities. It was built for a buyer who doesn't compromise, who wants the finest version of the finest thing in the finest neighborhood, in the finest city for this particular kind of wealth. That buyer exists. They have always existed. And Bel-Air has always eventually found them. The question that this house asks, and that the market is still in the process of answering, is what that buyer is willing to pay right now, in this moment, with all of these forces in play. Not what they paid 5 years ago, not what the developer believes the property is worth, what the market in 2025 will actually bear. Because that number, whatever it turns out to be, is not just a data point about one house on one street in one neighborhood. It is a signal about the future of Bel-Air, about the future of Los Angeles as a city for the ultra-wealthy, about the future of what it means to own the most expensive address in America at a moment when the definition of the most desirable place to be is more contested than it has ever been. The house is extraordinary, the neighborhood is extraordinary, the moment is complicated, and in the end, that is what makes this story worth telling. Not because a $75 million house didn't sell, but because of what the asking and the waiting and the silence that followed tells us about who we are and what we value and where, in this particular chapter of American life, the people with the most choices are choosing to be. Why hasn't anyone bought this house? We've spent the last 25 minutes building toward an answer. We've talked about the neighborhood and its history. We've walked through every room. We've mapped the market forces that froze ultra-luxury real estate in Los Angeles at the exact moment this property came to market. We've looked at the mechanics of how trophy properties move, or don't, when the public market fails them. And we've zoomed out to the biggest question of all, what Bel-Air means now and where it's going. But we haven't talked about the ending yet. So let's talk about the ending. Here is what we know with certainty. 281 Bentley Circle was developed and brought to market at $75 million in 2023. It represented, by any objective measure, an extraordinary piece of work. The architecture was serious. The materials were world-class. The setting, 1.15 acres in the hills above Los Angeles, with ocean views, on a street in one of the most prestigious zip codes in the United States, was irreplaceable. Nobody built a replica of this house somewhere cheaper. Nobody could. And yet the market, in that specific moment, could not meet it at that specific number. That gap between what something is worth and what someone will pay for it right now is one of the most important concepts in all of economics. It is not unique to real estate. It happens with companies, with art, with entire industries. The gap is not always evidence that the seller was wrong. Sometimes it is simply evidence that the moment was wrong, that the buyer who would have paid the number was somewhere else, that the conditions that would have made the transaction feel obvious had not yet arrived. The question is what you do while you wait for those conditions. And here is where the story becomes instructive in a way that goes beyond this particular house. The developers had choices. Every day that this property sat without a buyer was a day of carrying costs. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, staffing, the quiet accumulation of expense that comes with keeping a 20,000 square foot mansion in Bel-Air in the condition a $75 million asking price demands. Those costs are not trivial. On a property of this scale, in this location, annual carrying costs can run into the millions. So the pressure to act, to reduce the price, to restructure the deal, to find some way to close the gap and move on. That pressure is real. It grows with time, and it creates a dynamic that sophisticated buyers understand very well, which is why in the ultra-luxury market, patience is not just a virtue, it is a negotiating position. The longer a seller can hold without blinking, the more credibility their price retains. The moment they blink, the moment a public price reduction signals that the number was never real, they don't just lose a few $1 million. They lose the psychological architecture that made the price defensible in the first place. The developers of 281 Bentley Circle understood this, and so they did what the playbook for this situation calls for. They worked the private channels. They reached out through the relationship networks that operate below the surface of the public market. They maintained the property. They waited. And then something happened that nobody in the ultra-luxury real estate market, or frankly, anywhere else, had planned for. In late 2024 and into early 2025, wildfires tore through areas near Los Angeles with a ferocity that the region had rarely experienced in living memory. The Palisades fire burned thousands of acres along the urban edge of the city in November 2024, destroying structures and triggering evacuations in neighborhoods bordering Bel-Air itself. Additional fires followed in early 2025. The human cost was staggering. Lives disrupted, communities displaced, a wound in the fabric of the city that will take years to heal. For the real estate market, the implications were immediate and complex. Properties that had been on the market went off. Insurance, already strained in California's hillside zones, became nearly impossible to obtain in many high-risk areas, with premiums rising 50 to 100% for those who could still find coverage at all. Buyers who had been circling pulled back. The conversation about where it was safe and financially prudent to own property in Los Angeles shifted overnight. Bel-Air sits in the hills. It is not immune to fire risk. The neighborhood learned that lesson as far back as 1961, when a fire destroyed more than 5,000 acres and hundreds of homes across the hillside. That history does not go away. And for a buyer already weighing the mansion tax, the income tax, the carrying costs, and the thin exit market against the appeal of the address and the views, the addition of serious, documented wildfire risk to that calculus is not a minor consideration. It is the kind of thing that makes a borderline decision into a clear one. Not a clear yes, a clear no. So where does that leave 281 Bentley Circle? The property, as of early 2026, is off the public market. No active listing, no confirmed sale at the $75 million ask. What has happened in the private channels? What conversations have been had? What offers have been floated? What number might eventually close a deal? None of that is publicly known. This market does not broadcast its negotiations. It never has. What we can say is this: the property exists. It is real. It is extraordinary. And somewhere between the $75 million that the developers believed it was worth and whatever the market will ultimately bear, there is a number that makes a transaction possible. There always is. The question is simply whether the seller and the right buyer find each other before the carrying costs, the shifting market, and the accumulating weight of time make that number unacceptable to one side or the other. That is not a story unique to this house. It is the story of every trophy asset that reaches too far ahead of the moment it inhabits. It is the story of ambition meeting reality, of vision meeting patience, of the gap between what something is and what the world is ready to pay for it on any given day. But here is what I keep coming back to. This house was built by people who believed, genuinely, expensively, stubbornly, that extraordinary things deserve extraordinary prices. That if you do something at the highest possible level, the market will eventually recognize it. That patience is not the same as failure. That belief is not naive. history supports it more often than not. The great trophy properties of the world, the ones that define what a neighborhood or a city represents at its highest expression, do not stay unowned forever. They find their buyers. Sometimes it takes a year, sometimes it takes a decade. But the properties that survive, that maintain their integrity, their condition, their identity, tend to find, in the end, the transaction they were built for. 281 Bentley Circle was built for one buyer, one specific person with one specific vision of what their life looks like, who will walk through that motor court and across that Portuguese limestone and out to that infinity pool and look at that ocean and feel something shift inside them, something that no spreadsheet captures and no tax attorney can quantify. That person exists. They have always existed, whether they've already found this house in the quiet of a private negotiation, or whether they're still out there, still accumulating, still deciding, still moving through the world toward the moment when they're ready. That part of the story hasn't been written yet. And maybe that's the most honest thing we can say about a $75 million house in Bel-Air in 2026. The asking is clear. The house is ready. The rest is waiting. If you found this kind of story interesting, one property, one neighborhood, and everything it reveals about money, ambition, and how the world actually works, there's a lot more where that came from. And as for 281 Bentley Circle, it's still there, waiting. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.